HOA enforcers secretly changed Darren's house number overnight, hours before his wife collapsed, and 911 couldn't find their home. Their smug president, Doug Maddox, called it a mix-up, brushing off a near tragedy. But Darren was a retired fire marshal, and he knew exactly how to bring the law down. Just wait until you see how this neighborhood power trip turned into a $50,000 reckoning. Darren Callahan had lived on Meadowline Drive for 8 years without much incident. His home was tidy, well-kept, and easy to find, big brass numbers, 1621, right above the porch light. But that evening, when his usual pizza delivery driver called from 2 streets away, confused and frustrated, something felt off. "I'm at 1621, man," the driver said. "This house has a flagpole, 2 pumpkins, and a welcome mat with chickens. It doesn't look like yours." Darren stepped outside, puzzled, and froze. His house number wasn't 1621 anymore. Cheap black plastic digits now read 1627. The mailbox had been painted over to match, and even the numbers on the curb had been redone with sharp, clean stencil work. It wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. At first, Darren laughed nervously. Some weird prank, maybe. Teenagers? A bored neighbor? But Carla, his next-door neighbor, squashed that theory fast. She'd seen 2 men wearing reflective vests with HOA enforcement printed on the back working late the night before. They had a ladder, a red toolbox, and a clipboard. She assumed they were doing sanctioned repairs, but the HOA had said nothing. No notice, no email, no request. Darren was still stewing over it the next morning when the real disaster hit. His wife Megan collapsed in the kitchen without warning, her heart condition flaring up in an instant. Darren called 911, his voice shaking as he gave their address. 1621 Meadowline Drive, the dispatcher confirmed. Help was on the way, but help didn't arrive, not for 12 minutes. Darren stood in his driveway, scanning every direction, waving frantically. Sirens could be heard blocks away, circling, fading, coming back again. Paramedics finally appeared, pulling into the wrong driveway, then backing out, still looking for the right house. By the time they reached Megan, she was barely responsive. Later that night, at the hospital, one paramedic quietly told Darren they'd been dispatched to the right street, but the address didn't exist. The number didn't match any house. They'd lost precious time trying to guess where she might be. That was when the fear in Darren's chest hardened into something else. This wasn't a clerical error. Someone had deliberately changed their home's identity, and in doing so, they'd put Megan's life at risk. He didn't know why the HOA would do something so targeted, but now he was certain of one thing. This wasn't negligence, it was deliberate, and it wasn't going to be ignored. 3 days later, the HOA held a special emergency session in the clubhouse. The folding chairs were packed, and Darren sat in the front row, arms crossed, barely blinking. Douglas Maddox, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room in his signature blue golf shirt, flanked by 2 of his favorite board members, Jason from Lot 14 and Linda from the Garden Committee. They sat like bookends, nodding before he even spoke. Darren didn't expect an apology. He just wanted an answer. But what he got was a performance. "We looked into the matter," Doug began, glancing around with affected concern, "and it seems there may have been a mix-up with a maintenance order. These things happen." Then he smirked. A smirk, in the same breath as explaining why an ambulance couldn't find Darren's home during a medical crisis. Darren didn't speak, not yet, but inside something snapped. Doug had never liked Darren or his wife. That was no secret. Darren refused to pay into the HOA's voluntary enhancement plan, which was little more than a slush fund for vanity projects, mailbox upgrades, street banners, solar path lights. If you didn't contribute, you were seen as a problem. And if you questioned anything, you were treated as an outsider. Darren had seen the signs before, petty things. Carla's motion sensor light mysteriously removed after she declined to host a community brunch. The Gonzalez family's driveway coned off for a phantom resurfacing project that never came. Empty gestures, meant to look accidental, but just inconvenient enough to remind you who was in charge. This wasn't new. What was new was the danger. Darren stared at Doug, wondering if the man even grasped what had happened. Megan could have died, all because someone wanted to prove a point, because a couple refused to fall in line with some unwritten loyalty test. This wasn't neighborhood management. This was a power game, and they'd just made it personal. For years, Darren had ignored the little things, rolled his eyes, let it slide. But now someone's hand had reached too far, too deep. They didn't just mess with his numbers. They played with emergency response. They put lives at risk. And Darren knew something else too. They thought they'd get away with it. They thought they'd buried it in plausible deniability. They were wrong. Darren Callahan wasn't just another upset homeowner. He had spent 27 years in fire code enforcement, and 12 of those as deputy fire marshal for the county. He knew the difference between a nuisance and a violation. What the HOA had done, intentionally altering an address without a permit or emergency coordination, wasn't just a mistake. It was emergency obstruction, a Class A code offense in their jurisdiction. And Darren had the training to treat it like a crime scene. He started with the doorbell footage from Carla's house next door. Her camera had captured everything: 2 men in reflective vests, a truck with no markings, and a ladder propped against Darren's front column. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. One man held a printed paper, reading it by flashlight. The other unscrewed the original brass numbers and nailed up the plastic replacements. No safety cones, no permits, no notification. Darren clipped the footage, downloaded it, and labeled every frame with detail. Then he cross-referenced it with HOA newsletters and public announcements. Not a word about address changes, no public record, no posted intent. So Darren filed formal complaints, not just 1, but 3, to the City Planning Department for unauthorized modifications, the County Code Enforcement Office for obstruction of emergency response, and the State Fire Marshal's Oversight Division. Then he filed a Sunshine Act request, demanding all HOA maintenance work orders for that week. What he got back was damning. Nothing. Not a single documented reason for any address work on his property or anyone else's. And then came the background checks. Using publicly available databases, Darren identified the 2 subcontractors. Neither was licensed for residential structural work. Both had been hired informally. One of them, Wesley Hartman, had a prior conviction for contractor fraud in another state. The payment? Cash. No receipts. No insurance coverage. Darren built a case file that read like an indictment. Photos, legal codes, timestamps, video stills, license records, witness statements. It was neat, clean, bulletproof. He sent it to the city's Fire Inspection Bureau with a short cover note. This alteration directly impeded emergency response and endangered life. Address tampering without municipal coordination is a direct violation of Ordinance 14.3b. 48 hours later, they called him back, not to ask questions, but to confirm action had already begun. The official notice arrived by courier, sealed in a thick manila envelope and stamped with the state seal. It was addressed to the HOA Board of Meadowline Estates and outlined the violations in sharp, unapologetic language. Willful obstruction of emergency services, unauthorized alteration of address identifiers, civil penalty, $50,000. The fine wasn't just a number, it was a declaration. What they did wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous, and now it was official. Douglas Maddox, the self-assured HOA president who once treated every meeting like a coronation, turned pale when the decision was read aloud at the next public session. Homeowners packed the clubhouse, whispering, watching. Darren didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The fine didn't come out of HOA petty cash. It went through their directors and officers' liability insurance, triggering policy reviews, increased premiums, and legal exposure. The board wasn't just fined. They were suddenly personally accountable. In a last-ditch effort to protect himself, Doug tried to claim it had all been the work of a well-meaning volunteer who overstepped. But Darren's evidence dismantled that lie in seconds. Work logs, emails, footage. He had laid the truth bare. The directive came from the top. It was ordered, coordinated, and hidden. The fallout was immediate. Within a week, The board resigned in full. Doug didn't show his face after that. Not on the trail, not at the mailbox, not even at his usual Friday HOA coffee meetups. A civil lawsuit followed from multiple homeowners, citing gross negligence and emotional distress. Legal firms began circling. As for Darren, he quietly replaced the numbers on his porch with solid, polished brass. Not just brass, gold-plated, engraved with his actual address, 1621 Meadowline Drive. McGeehan made a full recovery, and the couple returned to their daily walks with heads high and shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. But the real finishing touch? A small, tasteful plaque mounted beside the new numbers, perfectly aligned, perfectly visible, real address, real fire marshal, don't play with people's lives. It didn't just mark the house, it marked the end of unchecked power.